Welcome. It's great to have you back this week. There are a lot of things I love about reading scripture. And one of my favorite is reading passages from different gospels that tell the same story, but in different ways. And this week I had an opportunity to experience that. For in this week's assigned reading from the Gospel of Mark, we hear the story of how two disciples, James and John, got in an argument about which of them could sit one day in a place of honor. Now, word of the argument reached the other disciples, who then got sucked into a debate about status. As the Gospel of Mark was the first of the four canonical Gospels written, this then would represent the first account of that incident. When the Gospel of Matthew took form about 10 to 15 years later, the Matthean community made some editorial changes in its telling of that story. The community was uncomfortable presenting the disciples themselves in such a bad light. So in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, they took that request to sit in a place of honor out of the mouth of the disciples and put it in the mouth of James and John's mother. And then when the Gospel of Luke took form about 25 to 30 years later than Mark's, they went another step. For the Lucan community decided not to associate the power struggle with any individual. It even sort of cleaned up their request as well. In Luke chapter 22, verse 24, it said simply, an argument broke out among the disciples over which of them should be regarded as greatest. I can understand why the communities of Matthew and Luke wanted to clean up that original story. For in the first account, let's be honest, the disciples don't come across looking very good. Which raised an important question for me this week. Why didn't the Markan community that produced the gospel clean up the story as well? What value might there be in the messiness of that first account? Well, listen carefully as I read the first account of that story, and then let's spend some time together and see if we can find that value in its messiness. Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45, and I'll be reading from the Common English Bible. James and John, Zebedee's sons, came to Jesus one day and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. They said, "Allow one of us to sit on your right and the other on your left when you enter your glory." Jesus replied, "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink, or receive the baptism I receive?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said, "You will drink the cup I drink and receive the baptism I receive. But to sit at my right or left hand isn't mine to give. It belongs to those for whom it has been prepared." Now, when the other 10 disciples heard about this, they became angry with James and John. Jesus called them over and said, "You know that the ones who are considered the rulers by the Gentiles, they show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around. But that is not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the human one did not come to be served, but rather to serve and to give his life to liberate many people." And thus ends the sacred reading. So, in order to take on the question of why Mark's community didn't clean up that original story, you need to put it in a larger context. For you see, today's story is arranged in the Gospel of Mark at the end of a cycle of teachings that Jesus gave called the Passion Predictions. 3 times in the Gospel, Jesus predicted his suffering and death. 3 times the disciples resisted that teaching, and 3 times Jesus used that denial to teach about what it means to really follow him. And in each of those 3 corrections, Jesus uses the opportunity to stress something a little different about what it means to follow him. So what then is the unique angle in today's 3rd and final correction? Well, 2 things really. The first is the metaphor Jesus used to describe that life of service to which they are called. In the first 2 corrections, in order to make his point about discipleship, Jesus says that following him means doing things like welcoming or embracing children. Now, granted, while children were near the bottom of the social order of his day, that imagery still wouldn't have been too challenging, as many in the audience would have either had children of their own or been around them regularly. But in this 3rd and final correction, Jesus took it to a whole different level. In that last attempt to get his point across, Jesus used a new metaphor, that of a slave. And not just any slave, a slave to all. Oh, boy, that imagery must have gotten their attention. Which leads us to the second reason why the Gospel of Mark didn't edit that original embarrassing story. It gave the authors a chance to talk about what Jesus' death would have meant in the final verse of today's reading. In that final verse, verse 45, Jesus made it clear Mark made it clear what Jesus' death was all about. And here is where the best and most recent biblical scholarship can help us better understand what Jesus was suggesting. For you see, in much earlier translations of verse 45, such as the ancient King James Version, some translated Jesus' words to read that he had come to give his life, and I quote, as a ransom for many. But the more recent scholarship suggests that that is a poor translation of the Greek word listron. A more accurate rendering of that Greek word, they say, is what you heard earlier in the reading. That Jesus came, and I quote, to give his life to liberate many people. And that, my friends, the difference between a ransom and to liberate is a huge difference. For you see, if Jesus came to simply serve as a ransom, then it casts us in a rather passive role. For at most, our role would simply be to give thanks or praise for what he did for us. But if Jesus came to be a liberator, that changes things. For that sense of passivity is gone. For once we ourselves have been liberated from all that holds us back, we are then called to participate in the liberation of others. So what does that look like in modern images or standards? Well, I'm glad I asked. For this past Thursday, I dropped a video onto the church's YouTube channel that gives a great example of that. As a part of my Conversation That Matters series, I put down a conversation between myself and a gentleman named Chris Unti, who serves as the Director of Faith Relations for Habitat for Humanity of Greater Los Angeles. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Habitat, let me just say this about how they and their volunteers are living as both liberated and liberators in the spirit of today's passage. Now, as most Angelenos know, here in LA, our community has long been in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. And the consequence of that crisis is that many people, including more and more working people, have become homeless. Over the past decade alone, homelessness has skyrocketed, and today it is the #1 concern, pollsters say, of Angelenos. Now, while the crisis might seem relatively new to some, 46 years ago, a couple by the name of Millard and Linda Fuller saw where things were headed in this country. So, drawing upon the teachings of Jesus, they created a model for affordable housing that today we know as Habitat for Humanity. Now, Habitat knew that if we were ever going to seriously address that crisis in affordable housing, that we could no longer be slaves to the world and to all of its assumptions. So the Fullers broke those chains and shackled themselves instead to the ways of Jesus and started doing things that had never been done before. They reached out, for instance, to families in communities whose salaries were low, typically between 30 and 80% of the median income in their community. They reached out to the very people who could have never secured a loan from a traditional bank or credit union. And guess what they did? They gave them a loan, in many cases at about 1% interest. And when they drew up the terms for the mortgage, they made sure that those monthly mortgage payments would never exceed 30% of the borrower's income. They didn't stop there. For they knew that when you follow Jesus, all of the power structures and all of the web of relationships must get turned upside down as well. And that's why, at least partly, they required every family who was chosen to receive a home to put in 500 hours of what they called sweat equity. It was their way of connecting the family to a support network in their own community. And once again, the Fullers didn't stop there. They had a vision that in their effort to end homelessness, that they would need to reach out into the community and get volunteers to help build those homes. They did so for a couple of reasons. On a practical level, it kept costs down. But on another level, and I would say even more important level, they knew that it would bring community members together. Bankers, doctors, teachers, and the retired, so that they could work side by side with a family in need, and together pick up hammers and trowels, and in that process, get to know and care for one another. In the process of constructing a home, they learn to deconstruct all of the judgments and stereotypes that, sadly, the haves hold against the have-nots. And because of the vision of those two followers of Jesus, over the past 45 years, they have brought together more than 35 million people in over 70 countries together to build affordable housing and indestructible friendships. They worked so hard that in their 37th year of operation, in the year 2013, they became the largest nonprofit builder in the entire world. And that, my friends, is what happens when followers of Jesus like Millard and Linda Fuller not only hear Jesus' words, but take them to heart and follow them. That is what happens when they and we leave behind all of the assumptions that the world that we've been chained to, and instead commit ourselves to a new way of being. a way of being when we are thrust into the roles of both the liberated and the liberator. So, you may not be grappling currently with a problem quite as big as the disciples' need for recognition, or as big as the Fullers' need to end the affordable housing crisis, but chances are you've got something that's eating away at you this very day. If that's the case, I invite you to take in Jesus' words today in a deeper way. Hear in them a challenge to push beyond the temptation to keep your relationship with Jesus casual, and instead commit or chain yourself to him. Follow him where he leads, even if that means turning all of your assumptions about what is possible upside down. And as you surrender your personal agendas and egos, watch for evidence of the liberation that will follow, knowing that in the letting go, you will experience the freedom of a life lived anew. May it be so. We'll see you next week.